Hello, everybody, and welcome to Macro Pro and Friends. We're sorry that there was a delayed start. We had a smart glitch in the system today, but it seems like everything has been fixed. I'm Diane Cohen, and I am here joined with Michelle, Logan, and Beth, and Michelle will introduce everybody. But before she does, I just want to do a little bit of housekeeping with everybody, just to remind you that today's webinar is worth 1 CEU credit. You should receive that in about an hour. If you don't, you have about 30 days to contact me to help you. After that, I can't help you. This webinar is going to be on, it will be on the Macro Pro YouTube channel. So if you want to watch it again, because there's jam-packed with information. That's one thing we know for sure. When Allan Koba comes, we get lots of information. And so I am going to remind you, you can download your handouts from the control panel so that you have everything they're talking about today. And if you have any questions, go ahead and put them in the chat box. And at the end of the program, Debbie Wilson, everybody's friend here in California, is going to be reading the questions. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Michelle.
Thank you so much, Diane. And thank you to Macro Pro Webinars and all of our friends at Macro Pro and all of today's attendees for tuning in for our latest webinar. So glad to be here today. I'm Michelle Allan, principal of Allan Koba Compliance Solutions, which is a national full-service Medicare secondary payer boutique firm. Before I found my career passion in Medicare secondary payer more than 20 years ago, I was both a defense attorney and also a claimant's attorney. Having represented both sides of workers' compensation claims, I've been able to understand the practical implications of MSP in settlements, finding creative and effective ways to solve problems and break down barriers to claim resolution. In my other full-time job, I'm also a mother of 3 teenage daughters and their 3 dogs, which also requires that I consistently deliver creative and effective solutions. And speaking of solutions, possibly the most important challenge to our industry has been associated with Section 111 reporting risks. The emergence of civil monetary penalty rulemaking was published last fall. With those rules, we now have the ability to prepare for forthcoming government audits. One of our core values at Allan Koba is that we do the right thing by primary payers, injured workers, and also the government. To that end, my co-presenters and I today will outline best practices for ensuring that your Section 111 program is fully compliant and performing optimally. With me today are Debbie Wilson, our Vice President of Business Development, who will be moderating, as well as my co-presenters, Logan Pry and Beth Hostetler. Logan, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, thanks, Michelle. And thank you, everyone, for joining us this afternoon or this morning or wherever you may be. I'm Logan Pry, the Vice President of Medicare Compliance for Allan Koba Compliance Solutions. I head up both our conditional payment and Section 11 reporting departments here at AKCS. Along with Michelle, I'm also a licensed attorney, and I have a bit of an interesting background. I've spent roughly the last decade or so in the Medicare secondary payer space. However, prior to that, I was involved in other areas of compliance, including False Claims Act, Star Clause civil matters, and Medicaid benefits protection. If we go a little further back, my education is actually in the natural sciences, specifically in biochemistry and molecular biology, which gives me a bit of a unique eye to these matters in the MSP space, which require, that blend of legal and medical expertise, particularly when we're looking at Section 11 reporting, and we're going to get into quite some detail on diagnostic coding and things of that nature. Throughout the years, I've been involved in the development of multiple software and SaaS products aimed at Section 11 reporting and MSP compliance in general. And as far as the crux of sort of what we're here to talk about today in Section 11 reporting auditing or running a diagnostic review, I've been involved in dozens and dozens of Section 11 reporting audits. Before we jumped on the phone today, I was trying to maybe estimate how many individual claims I've audited, and it's at least over 80,000, and I think I'm missing a few in there. So quite a few claims audited. And these projects have varied widely in scope and volume. For self-insured entities, for auto carriers, work comp carriers, general liability RRE'S, governmental entities, and other risk pools. So quite a wide variety of different types of Section 11 projects there. These projects allow us to stay up to date on what's going on with both CMS and those updates' impact on our space across the country. For example, just today, the COBSW was updated. So in a space where you would think it would be a little bit static, talking Medicare, there's always something changing, always something evolving. So we're glad to be here today. Also joining us is Beth Hostetler, who many of you know through her years in the MSP industry. Beth, you want to tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, some tough acts to follow. Good morning and good afternoon, depending on where you're at. I'm so glad that you could join us for this very, I think, meaningful presentation and aptly timed given what's looming around the corner. I've been in the field of risk management for longer than I dare to say, but it's over 30 years. I'm happy to say that I'm a nurse by background, and I've been certified as a case manager. I've been certified in life care planning, and most importantly, I've been certified in MSA allocations. I'm even more ecstatic that about back in May of this year, I joined this great organization, Allan Koba. Prior to this, I had been director of Medicare compliance for a Fortune 500 large retailer. When I first started that over 23 years ago, it was shortly after the Patel memo, I developed our MSA program, which included MSA vendor panel, a conditional payment resolution program. And then, very fortunately for this presentation in 2010, I was on the ground floor of the setup of Section 111 reporting for our company. I'm also very proud of the fact that I developed one of the very first MSA non-submission programs in the country, which I do believe served as a role model for other subsequent evidence-based medicine non-submit programs that came to be. Obviously, we've gone through some changes with non-submission. Had been a longtime board member of the National MSPN Network until I term limited out, and I was a regular speaker at their annual meeting as well as other known national industry functions. In my free time, for many of you who know me, I'm an avid tennis player, love being on the court, and I find the problem solving that I do on the court helps keep me mentally fit for solving these many Medicare complexities. But most importantly, in my free time, my tennis keeps me fit to keep up with 4 grandchildren and happily to announce a 5th on the way. So, and happy to be a part of this presentation today.
Thanks so much, Beth. Let's move into our roadmap and learning objectives. And by the way, Beth, I would never want to get on the tennis court with you. I think you would destroy me. And Logan, your 80,000 claims that you audited, that makes me think that that should be a game that we play at one of our next Allan Koba get-togethers, like trying to guess how many jelly beans are in the jar. Yeah. But Beth and Debbie, you're not allowed to play because you already know the answer. I never would have guessed that many. That's a lot. So we'll get right into it here. Roadmap and learning objectives for today's webinar. Section 111 reporting basics. Evaluating risk, conditional payment resolution and civil monetary penalties, key fields in a diagnostic review, takeaways from a self-insured perspective, evaluating a Section 111 partner, and industry updates. Next slide. So let's begin by talking a little bit about Section 111. For any joiners on the call who are not familiar with Section 111, this is a requirement that is brought to us statutorily and is reflective of Medicare's goals to make sure that they are being put on notice any time a primary payer has a responsibility to make medical payment for a Medicare beneficiary. And this rule was set forth a long time ago in 2007 with a penalty as stiff as up to $1,000 per claim per day, which really put the industry in a tizzy to make sure that they were being compliant and notifying Medicare of any and all Medicare beneficiaries for which they had a primary payment responsibility. And it's important to know that after this law was set forth, a piece of legislation was set forth also to try and tone that down a little bit and to make it a discretionary penalty rather than a mandatory penalty. And this rulemaking that would describe how and when primary payers could be fined for Section 111 reporting noncompliance was only published last year. It was brought forth on October 10th, and then it had a publication date in the Federal Register of October 11th. So we're dealing with just under a year now of knowing and understanding what sort of requirements there are for full compliance with civil monetary penalty rulemaking under Section 111 reporting. And we'll talk a little bit about that today. And we're also going to discuss how you can make sure that your program is compliant and error-free, and to make sure that you're mitigating any and all risks of such considerable potential fines. Next slide, please. Section 111 reporting basics. These involve the data reporting to the government directly from responsible reporting entities, which is a bit of that has been set forth by CMS. Anybody who has a primary payment obligation, which would include liability or self-insurance, workers' compensation, and auto and no-fault carriers. So anybody who might have an obligation to make medical payments with a bodily injury claim. And the purpose of this is consistent with the Medicare Secondary Payer Act. The Medicare Secondary Payer Act existing to protect the financial integrity of the Medicare trust and to make sure that Medicare is not making payments when they don't need to be making payments and primary payment responsibility belongs elsewhere. So the goals of Section 111 reporting are to make sure that through this notice that Medicare receives, they avoid making payment when primary payment exists elsewhere, and also to recover any amounts that they have paid. And these are known as conditional payment reimbursements. Next slide, please. And this leads us into what some of those key data elements are that will impact risk. ICD-10 coding. Medicare wants to know what the codes are that are associated with the claim, because these are the ones that they're going to be looking at to make sure that they're not making payment on, and they're also going to be the ones that they utilize for conditional payment recovery purposes. An ORM indicator, ORM being a term that means ongoing responsibility for medical. Medicare wants to know when the window of responsibility opens, and then also when it closes, and that would be the ORM termination date. Alternatively, they will also want to know about the total payment obligation to claimants and what the date of that amount is, which is generally the settlement, judgment, award, or other payment date, what that TPOC amount is, the date of the injury, and they want to make sure that this is reported timely. They want to make sure that they are notified of whenever a Medicare beneficiary exists or whenever an obligation to make medical payments exists. And I'm going to turn the next slide over to you, Logan.
Thanks, Michelle. Let's get into talking about thinking about risk and assessing the risk in your Section 11 reporting, and specifically what risk sort of comes out when you have erroneous reporting going in, when you're getting technical errors, when you're not reporting things timely. In order to really carry our conversation for the rest of our hour here, let's try to split these risk assessments into really two categories. The first of those categories is the impact that your reporting has directly on your conditional payment resolution process. And the second category being the assessment of civil monetary penalties, as Michelle has sort of alluded to here. And then certainly going into how to set up a diagnostic review to ensure that you avoid these two sort of categories of risk. When thinking about Section 111 reporting and the impact that it has on your conditional payments, I think it's easiest to concern yourselves with the accuracy of the data that's going in when you're doing your Section 111 reporting, with a particular eye to a handful of those data fields. I know Michelle just had up maybe the 7 or 8 most important ones, or what arguably would be the most important data fields. There are, of course, tens and tens of data fields that go into a full claim input file, But if you really focus in on just a few of these key fields, I really think you can put yourself in a good position to avoid over itemization on your conditional payments and ensure that you have a successful appeal process moving forward once you do get those conditional payment notices and those demands for reimbursement. The first data field that I would really like to heavily emphasize is the ICD coding. Those diagnostic codes are essentially what CMS is going to use to say, okay, a carrier or a self-insured entity, some RRE out there has identified and claimed primary payer responsibility for these injuries for this time period that they're telling us about. So that's really the first stop there. Stop at your ICD coding, ensure that the ICD coding that's going in is accurate. I'd like to recommend avoiding over-reporting to any extent that you can. It's sort of a best practice to be efficient but also accurate in your ICD coding. So do not simply grab a medical bill and grab every ICD code off the top of that bill, right? Go through those things with a fine-tooth comb and make sure that you are only reporting codes that you are claiming responsibility for or that are being released under your settlement agreement, depending on sort of the facts of your matter. But ensure that you're being limited but reporting all conditions that are related to the claim. Arguably, the second most important data field after that would be your ORM indicator and your ORM termination date. So using these data fields, you are effectively telling CMS, this is the period of time that we've accepted responsibility for these conditions, and then your ICD codes go there. So ensuring that you are monitoring ORM termination throughout the life of the claim and terminating it whenever you can is also going to be key to avoid just telling CMS that, hey, we have open responsibility for ongoing for this claim, right? If you get a lien for a claim in which you have failed to report ORM term, you're going to face a bit of an uphill battle trying to convince CMS on your lien appeal that you no longer have responsibility for that claim, or excuse me, those bodily conditions, whatever it is that you have reported. It would not be unheard of for their response to be, well, hey, you told us that you have open ORM, you have ORM here, you're telling us that you have primary payer responsibility for these body parts. So ensuring that, not only that coding, but that ORM information is correct is going to be key in appealing these conditional payments. And finally, it's I don't want to call it a throwaway, but it's a bit of an afterthought only for the purposes today. I don't mean to say that this is an afterthought in general, but only for our limited focus today. But Medicare Advantage Part C and D information is also returned on the query results, and monitoring that and being as proactive as possible in investigating any conditional payments into those plans and ensuring the resolution can also help you avoid any Medicare Advantage plan coming back later, 1 or 2 years down the line saying, hey, you actually owe us $100,000 for reimbursement for treatment that you didn't even know occurred. So using that paid act data to your advantage, to your benefits, and being as proactive as possible in resolving any and all Medicare Advantage conditional lien statements as well can be key. Okay, and moving into the second category for assessing risk, the avoidance of civil monetary penalties. Michelle, do you want to run us through some of the details of the CMP and how they're laid out?
Sure, absolutely, and thank you, Logan. There was a lot of speculation in the industry prior to the publication of the final rulemaking as to what this would look like for primary payers and how and when and why a full penalty might be carried out by CMS and what their methodology might look like. What's really interesting about this is that they had published a draft rule right before the pandemic. I believe it came out February 19th, 2020. Is that right? And in that draft rule, they had proposed 3 different areas by which primary payers could be found to be non-compliant. Exceeding error thresholds, providing contradictory information, and then also failing to timely provide information to CMS through the Section 111 reporting were all identified as potential areas of non-compliance. And thanks to the stakeholder industry really speaking out in the official comments and trying to get Medicare to make this as simple as possible and as usable as possible for the payer community, Medicare did make significant changes whenever it issued the final rule, and really isolated down the area by which primary payers could be found to be non-compliant, that being based on timeliness. Timeliness is defined as the date that CMS should receive a record, is determined by the effective coverage date, which would be the ORM assumption, or the date of the TPOC, or the TPOC funding if the funding of the TPOC is delayed, plus 1 year or 365 days. So primary payers have 1 year to provide that information to CMS. The date of applicability, as I had mentioned earlier, the publication date in the Federal Register was October 11th, 2023. The date of applicability being 1 year after that date. According to the Federal Register, no civil monetary penalty will be imposed until at least 1 year after the latter of the applicability date of this final rule, or the coverage effective date, or ORM, or settlement date for TPOC. So these are the effective dates and the dates of applicability for any civil monetary penalty. It's also important to note that claims for audit will be selected from various sources. What Medicare put in the publication was that they would be conducting quarterly auditing, and that they would be looking at various records from various sources, not just from the Section 111 reporting. So that's something that is still being questioned by the industry, where Medicare is going to be looking to be finding reports out. We don't know just yet, but they have not really drilled down anything specific. They can get information from various sources. So any information that they receive appears to be fair game at this point. Next slide, please.
Michelle, when we move to this next slide, I just want to add something to what you were pointing out about the government essentially boiling down the proposed rule to the final rule that we have now. And it does read a lot cleaner, to your point, where they've removed additional categories and have really zoned in on the timeliness of that reporting. However, I think there may be a pitfall with that boiling down with RRE'S and their partners' interpretation of that rule. While they are focused on timeliness, I don't think that we can quite throw out the other two categories of proposed penalty altogether. Although they eliminated any commentary on technical errors in the final reg, if you get technical errors in your ongoing reporting, those claims are effectively never reported, so they can never be timely. So while they eliminated a category for technical errors, I feel like there's still a bit of a back-end catch there for those technical errors that certainly do happen. And that's not entirely indifferent for removal of the contradictory information as well. Sure, the final rule may not read as though a penalty will be assessed for reporting contradictory information. However, as we know, if you, let's just set up a hypothetical, if you do something like report ongoing responsibility for a knee injury when you really have a shoulder injury, once you get that lien containing treatment for a knee injury, it's going to be an uphill battle to try to convince CMS that, oh no, this is actually a shoulder injury, if you've reported that sort of contradictory information.
That's a really good point, Logan, and it really does speak to the complexity of how this rule can be interpreted. And until Medicare starts conducting actual audits, we've been working with the information that we've been receiving. And I will point this out, and this is sort of a shameless plug for the Medicare Secondary Payer Network, which we're a member of. Medicare has been incredibly forthright about the information that they've been conveying relative to the civil monetary penalties, and they've allowed the Medicare Secondary Payer Network to engage in live Q&A with them, the first time being right after the publication of this rule last year. And the annual conference is later this month, and it's being held in Baltimore, and Medicare is slated to be there in person. And now that we're almost a year out from the publication of the final rule, I think that payers have had more time, practitioners have had more time to think about how all these things play out. To your point, Logan, yes, there isn't going to be a minimum error threshold. There isn't going to be a very straight line on contradictory information being furnished to Medicare, but these two things are still in play somehow, some way, with what the final rule looks like, and with having access to ask Medicare officials how they intend to audit and how these factors play into their audits. We have a really great opportunity to learn more in the coming weeks before any sort of audits will be conducted in the future. So thank you for that. Those are very good points, Logan. And moving into a little bit more information about what was in the final rule, there's information about the appellate process. So if you are in fact audited as an RRE, there's an opportunity to go through a full appellate process, which would begin with a pre-notice. CMS is going to be conducting these audits themselves. They're not hiring a third party. They're not going to a recovery audit contractor. They themselves are administering the appellate process, or I'm sorry, the auditing process. And so the first place that you could go to would be CMS for a pre-notice to an RRE being provided prior to any sort of CMP enforcement. So there's an opportunity to have a dialogue with CMS about what their findings might look like, and to provide mitigating evidence before any CMPs would actually be assessed. Any CMP is subject to this appellate process, which is formalized through 42 CFR 402.19 and also 1005, if you'd like to look that up and do a little bit of reading. There's an opportunity to have a hearing within 60 days in front of an administrative law judge. So if you're looking for a neutral, impartial party, you have your day in court. And there's also the ability to have an appeal filed with the Department of Appeals Board. So there's another layer to that as well. So there's a lot of opportunity for RREs who are audited to take this through an entire process to make sure that they have their opportunity to speak to what sort of mitigating evidence they might have or reasons why there could be potential noncompliance. And there's also safe harbors that are allowable. Any time delays caused by CMS or its contractors in the reporting process, RRE compliance with any reporting thresholds or other reporting exclusions is going to be something that is taken into consideration. Untimely reporting due to lack of cooperation by the beneficiary, and we've seen Medicare make this point before, where they want compliance, but not at the expense of a beneficiary's reluctance, unwillingness, or protection of their own personal private health information. So that's something that has been an issue in the past, and Medicare is taking note of that. And then also, if that is something that RREs are going to be bringing up, they need to retain records and maintain proof of good faith efforts. And best practices are to maintain this record for 5 years. Information or documents that would lend themselves to mitigation of noncompliance or to explain technical errors. The MSPN asked Medicare last year for details on what might be considered mitigating evidence, and they said, we don't want to create any barriers on what that might be. We're going to keep that wide open. So there's all sorts of opportunities for mitigating evidence, including any results of a mock audit that an RRE might want to prepare. And then there's a 5-year statute of limitations, and this would be imposed from the date when the noncompliance occurs. And it's very good that that was included in there as well. So by and large, there's a very straightforward and clear path here through what the final rulemaking looked like. And that gives RREs opportunities to engage in auditing that would mirror what Medicare is doing in this final rule. And I'll pass that back to you then, Logan.
Okay, so let's get into it. Let's start talking about a diagnostic review or an audit. And what can you do now to mitigate any risk that you might have? With respect to that second category for civil monetary penalties, your best bet is to report timely and accurately. If you haven't been doing reporting, start now, right? If you have been doing reporting, take an internal look at your reporting program. Is it going well? Are you getting any compliance flags for late reporting? Are you ensuring that your query data is entered on a timely basis and accurately, so that you're avoiding any false negatives on the query result and missing Medicare eligible claims that should otherwise be reported? Is your ICD coding efficient and accurate? So really dive into that and take a look at it. The second step would be to avoid and mitigate to any extent that you can. I know it may be close to impossible to be 100% effective on this as claims evolve throughout the life of a claim, but to stay up to date and avoid contradictory reporting wherever possible. That really speaks to that first category of risk that we were talking about in assessing your reporting risk, in ensuring that your reporting helps your conditional payment resolution process. So, you know, that's sort of a little bit silly of a hypothetical that we set up in which you have reported a knee condition on a claim only involving the shoulder. These are the types of things that we'd be looking at in avoiding contradictory reporting. But it goes past diagnostic coding too. Ensure that you're reporting ORM term on any claims that involved ORM as soon as you can, as soon as you know that your termination hit. So, you know, the contradictory reporting there would be avoid telling CMS that you have open responsibility for claims in which your responsibility has already ended, right? And same goes for TPOC. Report your settlement dates and amounts accurately and timely. And then finally, the third category sort of speaks to both areas of risk that you may be open to, and avoid error-free reporting. This one gets to be a little bit more technical. A lot of us on this call probably use some form of some type of software product to compile your quarterly claim input files and send them to CMS and also pick up the result. Some folks are still doing a lot of DDE, but it really depends on your reporting volume. But assuming that we're using a software product, you know, avoid getting user errors from bad data entry. Ensure that your data is going in error-free, avoid typos, make sure it's going in, not missing anything. It's easy to skip over some of these data points. There's so many data fields in a claim input file. Ensure that you are not getting those technical errors back and that your claim input files are being properly processed in a timely manner by CMS. So when taking a look internally, when performing a diagnostic review of your Section 11 reporting program, what should you do? I think a best practice would be to take a very simple three-step approach, and then we'll get into quite a bit more detail here in just a minute. But in general, from 30,000 feet, perform a diagnostic review, review at least a sampling of your claims. You know, do a blind selection if you can, review a claim selection, as well as your internal policies and procedures, and try to identify any areas of concern. That way you can sort of zone in on the project and make it tailored fit to what you may have going on. You may be doing some things perfectly and then missing on some other data fields. So try to identify any potential areas through a diagnostic review of a claim sampling. That can really help you sort of project your risk across a larger data pool. Once you've done that, I think your next step would be some element of claim remediation. If you've identified that some data going in is often inaccurate, or it's inaccurate a certain percentage of the time, or you're always missing ORM term date, or your TPOC dates are always off by this amount of time, fix those claims, right? Fix them and get updates sent into CMS. If for no other reason, that's going to help your conditional payment appeals on all of those claims that you are able to get remediated. So after you've identified areas of risk, get those claims fixed and report updates as needed. And then finally, some sort of annual or at least biannual maintenance, right? Whether it's doing those projects all over again or assessing how and what impact those improvements had from the last time you ran the project can certainly be helpful moving forward. Always keeping your policy and procedure manuals up to date, ensuring that everyone on your claims team has access to those types of documents is going to be key. As Michelle noted while we were talking about the audit methodology and the appeals process for civil monetary penalties, I think adding on to the list of things that may count as mitigating evidence would be things like your internal policy and procedure manual, evidence that you're running these types of projects over and over again, that you're identifying areas of risk, trying to fix them, and really outlining a path for CMS to see, hey, we are making a good faith effort to do this reporting timely and accurately. We're not just burying our head in the sand and saying whatever goes in, right? We are making the best faith effort that we can to make sure this stuff gets done right. So when taking on step one of that three-step sort of best practice and setting up a diagnostic review for a claim selection, what areas should you look to, right? It may be a little bit too daunting to just say, okay, we need to look at absolutely everything. So just to start, a good starter would be Medicare eligibility. review your team's collection of what we like to call the big 5 data fields. That's first name, last name, gender, date of birth, and social security number. Those are the 5 fields required to run a Medicare query. Review the collection and timeliness and accuracy of those fields going into your system. So are you running the Medicare query timely, or is there, a year, 18 months delay between acceptance of the claim and when that data goes in? Ensure that there's no typos or transposed digits that may be generating a false negative query result, right? The worst thing that can happen is you miss a date on the date of birth or something, and it continues to return a false negative or a negative query result, such that you miss a Medicare eligible claim that should have been reported just because you had a simple typo in one of those big 5 data fields, right? So ensure that the Medicare eligibility is being done first, ensure that it's done right, because then you can sort of move on to all the other data fields. A next stop would be CMS date of injury and industry date of injury. And maybe most importantly, knowing the difference between those two. So ensuring that your claims team or whoever's doing this data entry is aware of CMS's definition of CMS DOI and industry DOI, which, let's be honest, can vary a little bit from how we use them a little bit more generally in our industry and in the insurance space in general. In very short, CMS DOI is essentially the first date of injury for claims that occur over a period of time, so like exposure, ingestion, those types of things. CMS DOI is the first date of exposure, and industry DOI is the last date of exposure or coverage for those types of industry injuries. In the event of more of a traumatic single day injury, they can be the same DOI, or industry date of injury is actually optional for single date types of injuries. So on those types of injuries, you only need to put in the CMS DOI. But ensuring that they're accurate and they're correct going in not only avoids technical errors, but also avoids duplicative recovery by CMS. So it could very well be the case that some other carrier or plaintiff's or claimant's attorney has self-reported this claim using a different DOI. So ensuring that it's accurate will avoid a second case being opened and essentially CMS coming after treatment again on a second date of injury that's not actually a second date of injury. Of course, you're going to want to review diagnostic coding. This one's sort of, the meat and potatoes of a project like this, right? Let's ensure that our coding is being done correctly, timely, accurately. Avoid over-reporting and under-reporting, as we've sort of mentioned. Avoid just grabbing medical bills and pulling them on without reviewing. If you do have a software program that grabs medical bills and pulls ICD codes off of them, I think it's also probably a best practice to ensure that somebody reviews them at some point, right? You really just do not want to buy yourself a lien that you otherwise wouldn't be responsible for, because there's entirely unrelated diagnostic codes on there. Then, of course, ORM and ORM termination. I think this, again, sort of lends itself to ensuring that your claims are reviewed throughout the life of the claim, right? There may be an ORM termination that's not just the full and final settlement that you could have available to you, capping your responsibility for medicals. Death of claimant's also kind of an obvious one on top of medical settlements, but a physician's release from care. If the treating physician has indicated, hey, this injury has resolved and no future medical is needed, you can use the date of that record for ORM termination. You can use CMS's 5-year $25,000 rule, which has some criteria to it, but it's of note for claims that have less than $25,000 in medical paid. So if you have less than $25K in medical paid, there's been no treatment in 5 years, and it's not a claim that has an injury that has ingestion or exposure involved, and there's been no medical devices or implants done, so no artificial joints or spinal cord stimulators or anything like that. You can term ORM as of the date of last treatment for those types of claims. That rule is sort of aimed at claims probably in jurisdictions where there is lifetime medicals absent settlement, and it's permitting RRE'S to term ORM on claims that will not reach settlement, but otherwise will just sit open that have been stale for several years, right? So keep an eye out for that. And then, of course, any sort of jurisdictional or legal limitations that are available to you as well. Some low-hanging fruit here would be your insurance contract for a PIP or a MedPay claim that has, any sort of medical or time limit, 3 years or $10,000, whichever should occur first. Any sort of limitation like that on responsibility for paying medicals, you should use those to your advantage and report ORM term wherever possible. TPOC date and amount, I think the importance of that one is fairly obvious. You know, you want to report your TPOC date accurately, but maybe even more important is getting the amount correct so that there is a cap for the recovery limit possible. So do not over-report TPOC amount. And one common pitfall that we see with TPOC date and amount is, again, sort of CMS's a little bit strange definition of these two dates. So TPOC date is the date that the settlement agreement is executed or the date of court approval if required. And TPOC amount is the amount of the full settlement. So not just the amount marked for future medical or the MSA amount or something like that. It's actually the amount of the full settlement. Beyond these key data fields, I think it's a good idea to look to your historic reporting. Try to analyze any trending that you've had. Have you had compliance flags on a particular type of claim? Maybe, you know, a different insurance coverage types, or if you've had large settlement projects or things like that going on. Try to analyze any trends that you can. And then after that, I think while you're in there, you can also review a few things beyond the Section 11 data. So ensuring that conditional payments are being investigated and resolved wherever possible. And if applicable, Medicare set-asides on these claims. You're already reviewing claims that are Medicare eligible, right? So you know these are the types of things that you want to be thinking about while you're running a project like this. And again, I think it's important to note that these types of projects can really be tailored and scaled to the RRE's needs. It's certainly not a one-size-fits-all solution. We've run diagnostic reviews that have been sort of within a 48-hour sprint window, and we've also done them that have lasted as long for 2.5 years on par with 20,000 or more claims. So anything in between is okay. You just need to try to address what your shortcomings might be, what the risk exposures are, and then build a project around that. Beth, I'd love to turn it over to you to talk a little bit about the considerations from a self-insured perspective and maybe your experience in running a Section 11 reporting audit. Oh, Beth, you might be on mute. I can't hear you.
Oh, sorry. I had you on mute. Thank you both. Great job. All I can say is I'm glad I'm not an attorney like you and Michelle. You did a great job of the background on the law, key components of civil monetary penalties, audits, and most importantly, how to mitigate risk in this area. As you said, I would like to now talk about my perspective in this area and share some insights for the RRE'S. Just a little bit of history on my program to give you some context. For a majority of the time in my former position, it was an unbundled program. We were self-insured and self-administered. We then changed to a combination program, both insurance and self-insurance, and we moved to administration by a large TPA. It was at that time that really for two reasons, two motivations, gave me the impetus to undertake an audit. Firstly, as we've all heard about, was impending civil monetary penalties. I really wanted to get a clear picture of the health of our program. Secondly, when we did this conversion, I had some concerns. Again, we went from our own claim system now to a TPA claim system. I was concerned about the mapping of some of our closure codes and was concerned that files that we showed as closed in our system were not closed out and ORM was left open. So that was the motivation. We, as Logan said, he talked about large audits. The audit that I undertook at the time, I think started out, we identified about 14,000 claims, and I think when we ended, it was close to about 19,000 claims. So it was definitely a period of time. I'd just like to share a few of the takeaways for you to consider. Auditing, as Logan said, should be done a bit internally. So it can be done internally and externally, or a combination there of both. You should indeed have some protocols and best practices internally for assessing your data reporting, and really help you determine if a more extensive audit is necessary. Your selection of the kind of audit depends on many factors. The size of the audit, obviously you see how large mine was. It covered over 40 states. Scope of the audit, complexity, your internal ability to handle an audit of that kind. Are you experienced in that? Do you have the bandwidth to handle that? Certainly internal teams can manage smaller, more routine audits, and external vendors can conduct more comprehensive audits that I really think show you the depth of the compliance and, most importantly, identify gaps. Overall, while of course I did auditing on a smaller scale, particularly in regards to one of the things that Logan brought up was the importance of ICD-10 coding, because I believe it's the hallmark of everything in terms of the interplay between all of your components of an MSP program. I really came away after my audit feeling that the best way to get an objective and unbiased, quote, unbiased analysis of the health and integrity of your data is really by an outside external vendor. I also think helpful now, given that we have the details of civil monetary penalties outlined in terms of the amount. I didn't have this at the time mine was done, but your auditor can really give you a dollar and cents idea of what your risk is. Hopefully, as I experienced, you're going to get a reasonably good report card, and it's just fine-tuning your program. You know, Michelle brought up, and I think Logan too brought up a really good point, is that the documentation received from an audit and the subsequent changes that you make in processes as a result of the audit may potentially be considered by Medicare as mitigating evidence should you actually undergo a governmental audit. Obviously, none of us have had that yet, but we're going to see how Medicare looks at that. I think, Logan, you said it right. It shows that we take this seriously, we're doing our due diligence, and we're doing what's right to protect the Medicare Trust Fund. I kind of coined this term a post-migration audit. I think it's an opportune time for RRE'S really to take a deeper dive at your data. As I said, I had some concerns about the mapping of data. That's always a big change when anybody changes insurance carriers, TPAs, is the mapping of the data that it correlates appropriately. Okay. What are the overall benefits of an audit? I'm not going to spend a lot of time here because I know we're getting down to the hour, and Logan hit on a lot of the benefits. I'm just going to expand on a couple of the ones. Clearly identifies the discrepancies, errors, admissions that could result in significant penalties. Secondly, I know very, very, very clearly on this area. Logan talked about the great interface of Section 111 and conditional payments. And I think that's the most important part of me of an MSA program is resolution of those conditional payments. So the better the data in, the better the data out. I know that the efficiency, both internally and for my external vendors, improved greatly after that audit. It reveals weaknesses and inefficiencies in data collection and reporting processes. Certainly, while at the start of my audit, ORM closure was a primary focus, I certainly identified other areas and other opportunities for training that we implemented. And I would say not necessarily total remediation, but it was really refinement and reinforcement of things that we had already implemented in best practices. This next one, enhance an organization's internal and external reputation. Both Michelle and Logan alluded to that. Compliance with Section 111 demonstrates a commitment to regulatory requirements and ethical business practices. This certainly can enhance your reputation with stakeholders, especially CMS, but our customers, our business partners, insurance carriers, brokers, and lastly, which was critical to me in a self-insured program, employees. given the effect reporting can have on a Medicare beneficiary's benefit, this was so important to me. We had a long, long history in the company of self-insurance, and doing what was right and best for our employees was central core of our risk management program. Lastly, it clearly helps you identify training opportunities. The business partner that did my audit was so incredibly helpful in their report and in their training with me to point out state jurisdictional issues that would impact ORM termination. We implemented training particularly on this area. Logan brought up the 5-year 25,000 rule, and while it wasn't in effect at the time of my audit, we subsequently, because of the kind of thought processes they engendered in me, I developed a report to follow those cases and then more clearly one-on-one evaluate whether those can be terminated based upon those rules and exceptions. Okay, next slide. And my last slide. So I want to talk about evaluating an MSP partner for auditing and what I looked at, what I think you should look at. Certainly many RREs utilize their TPA or external companies as their reporting agent for this data. Can you and should you use the same vendors to conduct your audit? Certainly, and you should expect that your reporting agent helps you identify red flags, error codes, percentages of error. But it is important to remember that your agent relies solely on the data given to them by the RRE. And oftentimes they're not evaluating the big picture and processes in place. And that's where I found the benefit is the big picture and processes. Consider also that there may be internal bias when a reporting agent that may impact their credibility and objectivity. So let's talk about these points that are on the screen here. Consider the expertise, experience, and industry knowledge, their regulatory understanding, and compliance knowledge. Ensure the vendor has experience in Section 111 reporting. Look at their record, demonstrated by proven history of successful audits and client testimonials. How do you know that? Ask them for references. Talk to those references. Ask them for a sample report, a redacted sample report. Also, is your vendor a key player in the workers' comp industry? How do you know that? Do they provide regular training and webinars like this? Are they active in professional organizations? Next item, data security and privacy, ever so critical in this world today. Does your vendor use secure systems and practices to protect sensitive information? Dive into that in some detail. Can you validate their SOC 2 certification? Methodology and approach. Your MSP vendor partner should have a clear process and well-defined audit methodology. They should provide an initial contract with clear outlines of the scope of the auditing, including timelines, deliverables, report dates, including verbal reports. That was so important to me, is the verbal and the communication with the vendor partner. Ensure your pricing is clear, so there's no surprises. I think Logan brought out nicely, customization ability is critical. Obviously, I went to my partner with a specific goal in mind, and that obviously focused them on that. Can they specifically address your concerns, and can they tailor your approach to fit your specific business? Getting down to the end here, training and support. Can they provide training to your staff on compliance requirements and audit findings? Are they able to recommend clear mitigation and practical strategies? For my audit, I elected to have my vendor partner implement the corrective strategy directly into my system. I can't tell you how valuable that was from a bandwidth area. I didn't have the staff to do it, but more importantly, it gave me the confidence and the faith that the data was correct. Clear reporting. Expect a detailed and understandable audit report, again with actionable items. Specify to the vendor how you would like the reporting summarized and organized. Depending on your organization like mine, would you like it summarized by state, adjusting office, or other metrics you deem appropriate? I think that really helps you cue on the training opportunities, because one office may be doing one thing and another office may not. Not going to go into what should be addressed in the report, because Logan, you did a great job of summarizing all the audit components and the key indicators. The last and final thing I want to focus on is partnership approach. Look for a vendor that views this relationship as a partner rather than a transaction. How do you know this? This is very much based upon your instinct and how your partner approaches you and treats you. You both should come away from an experience feeling like you each made each other's organization better. I think, Michelle, you hit on some really important points that stood out to me now and stood out to me at the time of the selection of the vendor. Compare what your core beliefs and your core values are. One of the core values of the company that I work for was, as you said, always what was right and having the best interests of our employee at the heart of it. So again, don't be afraid to ask those questions of a vendor partner. In closing, I think if you thoroughly evaluate these factors, this will help you ensure you select the most capable and dependable vendor for your Section 111 audit. In doing so, as I experienced, you will come away with a clear state of the health of your program, a list of actionable items to correct, and most importantly, you will know the state of what lies ahead for civil monetary penalties, and hopefully they will be minimal. Thank you on that. I think we have just a couple more slides. Is that Logan?
Yeah, before we wrap up today, I know we're at the top of the hour here, but we did want to just round out our conversation with some industry updates. And I think maybe most important of which, or I should say maybe most pressing and on point for our conversation today, is the expansion of the Section 111 input fields to include WCMSA information. So this is going to be especially important for anyone on the call today that's in the comp space, that's preparing MSAs, or that's in the comp space that's not preparing MSAs, maybe even more important. But you want to be aware that beginning April of 2025, so just a few months from now, there are new fields added and required in certain circumstances to the Section 111 input file. Those fields are going to be the WCMSA amount, the WCMSA period, so the period of time that it's intended to cover. This is usually the life expectancy of the claimant. Lump and annuity information, so depending on how it's funded, if it's funded via lump sum or if it's going to be annuitized, that information needs to be in there, and that initial deposit amount and annuity amount if applicable. There are also some optional fields that are somewhat of interest to us here. Those optional fields are the case control number on the WCMSA if it was submitted to CMS. Obviously, if you didn't submit your MSA, or if it was under threshold so that you couldn't submit an MSA, this case control number is going to be optional. It's just going to be non-applicable in those cases. And same with the EIN of a professional admin company if you're using one. Again, obviously, if you're not having it professionally administered, if it's just going to be self-administered by the claimant, that would be NA as well. Now, what's important to note is there is a testing opportunity coming up in October. So a little bit less than a month away, testing begins for these new expansion fields. So it's not the case that you just have to show up in April and say, okay, I hope this works right. There is going to be testing opportunities, so you can send some sort of dummy data into CMS, make sure that your system's handling it right, make sure that it's reading the expanded claim files back in correctly, and all that good stuff. It does have some interesting impacts on, non-threshold MSAs, or I should say non-submitted MSAs. So both of those cases. But one thing that you will want to take under consideration, under advisement, is if you are not submitting MSAs that are of CMS review threshold, what you are now doing is reporting that MSA amount along with your settlement amount to CMS when you otherwise have not submitted that amount to them before. Now, it's not the case that they're opening a case and going to ask for all the MSA materials now. If it was a threshold, I don't want to say that they're never going to do anything like that in the future, but I think it is certainly noteworthy that CMS is collecting this data on MSAs now, particularly on cases that were not submitted and did not get CMS's rubber stamp of approval. There's been a lot of conversation over recent months and honestly over the last couple of years regarding $0 MSAs on both zeros for medical reasons and zeros for denied reasons. What, if any, will be the impact of this reporting expansion on those types of cases? What is CMS going to do when you report a TPOC amount of a fairly high value and a $0 MSA in that WCMSA expansion field in Section 11 reporting? Does that raise any red flags to CMS? Are they saying, hey, we don't have a case control number on this one, we didn't approve this? Is there some consideration to be made there when you have sort of a large discrepancy between your TPOC amount and the future medical amount, right? That may be perfectly legitimate. We're not saying that, in any of these cases that you're sort of pulling one over on CMS or the beneficiary or anything like that. But I think it's at least noteworthy, right? What is the information going in saying about your claims?
Obviously there's a lot of questions that arise from this. It's an important development and one that we'll likely be doing another webinar on, but definitely looking forward to speaking with CMS at the MSPN conference to see if we can learn more about some of the very thought-provoking items that Logan just mentioned. And with that, this concludes our webinar. So if anybody has any further questions or wants to talk to anybody at Allan Koba about a mock audit or their Section 111 reporting program, or what this change with the WCMSAs being entered into Section 111 reporting data fields means to them, please feel free to reach out.
Also, Michelle, I do have a few questions, and there are still a bunch of attendees on that we'd like to get to the questions if that's okay. Thank you for your patience, everyone, with our technical issues, and thank you for joining our webinar today. What a great amount of information that was had here. A few of the questions are here. There's only 4. Where can we locate the ICD 9 codes or ICD 9 and 10 codes? Is there a website for that? Logan, I know you deal with a lot of these. What do you know?
Yeah, Debbie, I can take that one. There are a lot of resources available out there. However, I know that MacroPro has an ICD lookup code on their website, so that may be, at least a good first stop. In addition to a lot of claim systems have sort of something like that available as well. However, I would like to recommend that you do still try to ensure that that code is accurate. Make sure that you at least review the description of the code prior to reporting.
Fantastic. Here's another question. When you settle a hearing loss claim with no future medical, do you need to report a TPOC or do we just update the ORM?
That's a good question. So there may be some nuance to it. So I just want to make sure that I understand the fact pattern, because I can imagine this settlement going a couple different ways. It would depend on whether or not this claim had the effect of releasing medicals in that settlement. If it did, then I would certainly report a TPOC. I think because in this scenario you've already reported ORM, so I think that would be the case. I would also understand a slightly different case which had ORM as well, but the medical condition had resolved so that there was no future medical. I think you would still want to review your settlements, and if your TPOC has the effect of releasing medicals, I would certainly recommend reporting TPOC. differing from an indemnity-only settlement where medicals are uninvolved entirely or medicals are still open into the future.
Great, thanks, Logan. And here's another one. If a claim is denied, is the ICD code required? If a claim is denied. So it was opened, it was denied, is it required?
Yeah, great question. So again, we're assuming that it's settled. So, throughout the life of the claim, so long as it's denied, there's no ORM, right? You have not accepted ongoing responsibility for medicals. So I do not think you have a reportable event yet in that case. However, if you later reach a settlement, you have a TPOC event, and that settlement has the effect of releasing medicals, even though you've never accepted liability for that claim, you do still have a reportable claim. So you will need to find a proper diagnostic code for the alleged injury that's being released under that settlement.
Great.
That would be a TPOC only report with the ORM indicator would just stay set to no.
Gotcha. The last question here, for future medical claims, if they have a STIP award with open medical, we do not put a TPOC date. Is this correct? Only if it was settled by a CNR.
Yeah, good question. And these, again, get very nuanced, right? So I do think you need to review the facts to ensure that you are handling it appropriately. However, in an indemnity-only settlement with medical staying open into the future, you do not have a TPOC that's reportable. That used to be gray for quite some time, and honestly, it is still a little bit gray, but in recent iterations of the non-group health plan user guide that governs how and when to do Section 11 reporting, CMS has at least attempted to add some clarity, and they've added in sections indicating that indemnity-only settlements are not reportable.
Thank you.
All right, everyone. This
There
seems
is
to
one
be
more
our
that
time.
came in. Given the option to settle future medical in California workers' comp claims, how should we apply the ORM for the 5-year less than 25 rule? So specifically, should we rely on this rule in cases where we administratively close claims due to a lapse in care or a 2-year inactivity period under self-insured regulations, but future medical award remains open? Do you want to do this one offline?
We certainly can. I think the short answer is yes. I think you should use these rules that are available at your disposal, provided by CMS, to report ORM term date whenever you can. So if all the criteria of that 5-year $25,000 rule has applied, I think it's a good idea. You can do some things like run a project for claims that have had no activity within 5 years and have less than $25,000 in medical pay, or some sort of criteria like that, right, on a body of claims, and at least see what volume of claims may meet that criteria. And I think that's a good starting point.
So the person that asked that question, Aaron, if you need more information on that, email me and I'll make sure that our speakers get your contact information so that they can reach out to you directly. So I'd like to thank Michelle, Logan, Beth, and Debbie for this informative presentation. And we will see you guys at the next Macro Pro and Friends. Thank you all. Bye-bye now.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.